Well, just imagine the nerves that John Alcock and Arthur Brown would have needed back on June 14th of 1919 to climb inside the open cockpit of their twin-engine Vickers Vimy, knowing that as soon as those lumbering engines started, that there was no turning back out of their high-risk plan. Of course, the plan was to complete the first ever nonstop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, in the end, that 16-and-a-half-hour flight put the British aviators in the history books, and it's a story that all started here in St. John's. A group called Aviation History Newfoundland and Labrador has announced its plans to celebrate the centennial in a pretty high-flying way. And joining us now to talk about those plans are aviation enthusiasts Paul Snow and Gary Hebbard. Welcome to the studio.
Thanks, Krissy. Thank you.
So how exciting is this centennial for aviation enthusiasts like yourselves?
I think it's fantastic. The implications of what those two men did nearly 100 years ago is just, it reverberates today through our total society. And to have a chance to celebrate that and to make people aware and share some of the excitement that we feel is just great.
And I want to get to some of the things that are coming up first, but the story at first, though, the story behind this flight is just so incredible. I mean, set the scene for us, Gary, if you can. I mean, how big a deal was this back in 1919 that these guys were going to set out to do this first nonstop transatlantic flight?
Well, sure. It obviously had not been done up to that point, and the technology by today's standards was very primitive. They were in an airplane made out of canvas and wood and wire. The internal combustion engine itself was only about 20 years old. So, they're not nearly as reliable then as they are today. So they put it all on the line and said, we're going to give this a try. And to make matters a little bit more interesting, they had 3 other teams that were trying to accomplish the same thing. So it was a competition. It's very much a competition. And there was an awful lot on the line.
Before we get to that, who were these guys anyway? What was their backstory?
They were both flyers in World War II for the Royal Air Force, and both had difficult war experiences, shall we say. They were both shot down at one time or another. And they were young and feisty and looking for some adventure and a chance to make their name. So I guess this is what they decided to do.
Man, oh man.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about the risk involved and them actually deciding to take this on, I mean, what would they have done to get ready for that flight?
I think probably most of the preparation would have been attempting to make sure that the airplane itself was as safe and as reliable and as ready to go as it could possibly be. And, like I said before, in those days, the technology isn't what it is today. So it was a question of just checking those engines day after day. And they did a few test flights and did what they could to make sure that they were as ready as they could be. And other than that, I mean, there was no weather reporting as we know it today, so they had no idea what they were going to face for weather going across the ocean. There was essentially no communication. They had a radio, but it broke down just after they took off. So once those wheels left the ground, they were completely on their own.
Even just getting those wheels off the ground, there was a lot of work, because, I mean, it's not like we had an airport here.
No.
Right?
No. They actually had to clear boulders and rocks and brush and what have you from what is now basically Black Marsh Road. And they started their takeoff run about where the Royal Canadian Legion Branch Number 1 is now on Black Marsh Road. And they lifted into the air at what is now the intersection of Albany Street and Black Marsh Road. So, and it was uphill, and it was rough, and it was bumpy, and there was trees at the end of the runway, and they were overloaded with fuel. So,
and it wasn't exactly a smooth takeoff, was it?
No, not at all, not at all. And there was genuinely some question as to whether or not they'd actually get off. And in fact, at least one of their competitors, who had made the attempt before, crashed on takeoff, not once but twice. So there was always that possibility, and with that much fuel aboard, it would have been pretty catastrophic.
What actually happened in the air is really, to me, the most compelling part of this story, because when you talk about challenges, I mean, they're in an open air cockpit. They're flying over the Atlantic. I mean, where did the challenges begin for them, and how did that unfold?
Pretty much as soon as they lifted off, because for almost the entire trip they were in cloud and fog. They never had very much altitude, so they were never very high above the ocean. And that means that if you run into any sort of mechanical problem, you haven't got much time to try and fix it and overcome the situation before you hit the water. So that was always there. But they ran into fog. They ran into icing. One of the engines almost quit because it got stocked up with ice. And at one point, they found themselves upside down, spinning towards the ocean.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So, it was a challenge, to say the least.
And I've heard that one of them had to actually climb out on the wing, right? Well, tell us that story.
That would have been Brown. He was the navigator. Alcock was the pilot. And it was that or crash. I mean, those were their alternatives. The engine air intakes were getting stogged up with ice, and if something wasn't done about it, the engine would quit. And on one engine, with that much fuel aboard, they wouldn't have been able to stay in the air. So Brown climbed out over the side of the cockpit and braced himself as best he could and set to work to knock off that ice and get it out of the way.
Even logistically, what would he have been hanging on to do that?
Well, there was all kinds of wires and struts and things around him that connected the two sets of wings. So he had plenty to hold on to, but he could only hold on with one hand because he needed the other hand to break the ice.
And I assume there's ice underfoot, too.
Probably, well, the wings would have been slippery for sure, no question about that, yeah. So he was literally standing on the wing and holding on with one hand and pounding at the ice with the other.
Wow.
Yeah.
Over the Atlantic Ocean.
Over the Atlantic Ocean,
with
probably a couple of thousand feet up, something like that. They were flying only about 100 miles an hour, but 100-mile-an-hour wind in your face is pretty significant.
So inside of this harrowing 16-hour flight, there was, and you mentioned this a minute ago, the generator, the power had gone?
There was a small generator that was run off a small propeller attached to the fuselage of the aircraft, and that supplied power for their radio. And excuse me, just after they took off, the generator broke, so they had no communications whatsoever.
I wondered what that would have sounded like, in an open air cockpit, and I actually found a recording done with modern recording equipment from inside of one of these recreation flights from one of these famous figure flights.
That was done here in 2005.
Okay, just take a listen so we all understand what that would have sounded like. It's loud. It almost shakes your head. And trying to communicate over that sound,
you would have felt it in your bones. The vibration would have been phenomenal. And then add to that the wind whistling by your ears and the cold. Not for the faint of heart.
It's amazing that they made it. I know it wasn't a smooth landing, but they were safe when they got there. Tell us that story.
Well, they arrived, amazingly enough, they were headed for England. They were only very slightly off course, which in itself is amazing when you consider that their navigation abilities in those days were very limited. They were basically flying with a magnetic compass and a sextant to shoot the stars to get their position. And when they finally made land, I don't think they knew exactly where they were. They had a general idea. And, of course, the first thing to do, there's no airports as such in those days. So they were looking for a place to land, and they saw this nice green, smooth, flat piece of land and figured, okay, here's a good place to land. They didn't know that it was a bog. So once the plane touched down, it nosed into the soft earth, and it kind of crumpled up the front of the plane. They were very, very fortunate not to be hurt. They basically just jumped out and walked away from it.
And became heroes, right?
Oh, absolutely, overnight. There was I don't know if it had happened before, but for their departure from St. John's, there was actually reporters here from New York covering their departure. And of course, when they arrived in Ireland, once they convinced people that, hey, yesterday we were in America, and today we're here, and those were the first two people in the world who could ever say that, they were lionized immediately. And they got their 10,000-pound prize that the Daily Mail newspaper had put up for the first people to do this. And they were knighted, and they were celebrated all through Europe.
It's an amazing accomplishment to celebrate, and of course, so many things. And Paul, I want to bring you in here. I mean, how do you even begin marking what happened here on this flight?
Well, you know, the funny part of it is it was a beginning. Newfoundland and Labrador's aviation history began with Alcock and Brown and continued to what you could best describe as a golden age of aviation. People didn't wear sweatpants and masks when they got on the planes in those days. It was a very heady business starting out. And you had not only the Alcock and Brown, but you had Amelia Earhart that came here. You had the famous Pan Am Clippers that landed and took off from Botwood Harbor.
Charles Lindbergh.
Charles Lindbergh picked out Botwood, actually. And you also had all the history that goes on with Gander. So that was really a beginning. It was an amazing, amazing story that triggered so much. It really started the commercial aviation industry. So that's kind of the backdrop of what Aviation History Newfoundland and Labrador was thinking. And, of course, Bill Mahoney and Jim Burton and, of course, Gary and his brother David and all these people have been at this a long time. I'm kind of a rookie enthusiast, but the more I learned about it, it's just the more exciting I've gotten. And, you know, yesterday when we did our announcement, I never met such a wonderful crowd of dedicated people. You know, I was talking to a pilot there who was 81 years old. He just gave up his license. You know, it's a phenomenal, deep community, and the public deserves to learn more about their history. I mean, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, I don't think realize the breadth and depth of the impact of Newfoundland and Labrador on aviation history, and it's important to bring that out.
And the very beginning, of course, going to be celebrated coming up in June. What kinds of things do you have planned for those celebrations?
Well, there's a few things that we want to do in the lead up, and one of those things is hopefully going to be a crosstalk program with CBC. I think it's important that we bring some experts in from the outside to talk about our place in aviation history and to talk about the Alcock and Brown story. And we're actually bringing Tony Alcock, who is a closest living relative and an RAF pilot himself, back to do a public lecture here, to come on your show, and if he has some time to maybe do some school visits. So that's teed up for May. And there's also a lot of discussion about the future of aviation, and we want to make sure that we bring that in because I don't know if you've seen some of the statistics, but there's 3,000 pilots are going to be short by 2025. There's 55,000 people required in the industry, and so it's not just a history lesson. I think we're talking about an opportunity for the future of our young people, and that's so important as well.
And why not start here? This is where it all began.
Absolutely. And there are some, the core of the events are going to happen from June the 12th to June the 16th, and it will include a street festival. The George Street Association to come on board, and there'll be a public performance. The city of St. John's will be hosting a reception right about the time they would have taken off. There's a gala ball that will happen on the night of the 14th.
It's amazing. I'm really excited about it. This is a big deal. I'm glad you guys are making a big deal about it. Thanks so much for coming in and sharing some of this with us.
Absolutely, our pleasure.
Our pleasure.
That was Paul Snow. You just heard from their last, and Gary Hebert in studio, talking about the first nonstop transatlantic flight that put Alcock and Brown in the history books. And the centennial celebrations, as they say, really take off on June the 12th. And you can find more about all of that on the website aviationhistorynl.com.